So basically, I'll be explaining this problem of support recovery. The first part of the talk would be more like a background, and in the second part of the talk, I'll get into this problem. But first, I would like to start by explaining the problem, and then I'll move on to the background part. So, so the setup is as follows. There is a set of n samples, x1 through xn, and each of these is of dimension d. Okay, so these are all vectors in some high dimensional space. D is a huge number, and all of them have a support that is the same. So across all the samples, the locations of the non-zero entries. So the support of a sample is basically the indices corresponding to where it takes non-zero values, and that is the same across all the samples. And we'll denote this support by this by S. Okay, so and this support is of size k. You don't get to fully observe these samples. What you observe is a linear sketch of each sample. So a sketch is basically a low dimensional projection of the sample. So for each xi, what you get to observe is this vector yi, and this vector yi is an m dimensional vector, and m is much smaller than d. Okay, and this sketch is obtained by multiplying with this sketch matrix or projection matrix Pi, which is an m cross d matrix. And so just to see this pictorial, let's say you're in 3 dimensions, d is 3, and all these vectors, their support is basically the set 1, 2. So they all lie on this 2-dimensional subspace of R3. But what you observe is, let's say, the projection of these points onto R2. Okay, so once you project them, they don't have any zero entries anymore. They can be like completely dense. And what is the goal here? The goal here is to estimate this common support given access to these sketches y1 through yn and the sketch matrices phi1 through phi(n). Okay, so that's the problem. How this set can be estimated. Dimension, or what is the, okay, I think something went wrong. Is the screen visible? I think there is some connection issues.
We can see the slide which has this 2 figures, and the first slide basically.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I think some connection was lost in between. Right. So, so I was just saying that I will come back to this problem and see how it is solved. But I'll first go into some background, as in where this problem originated and so on. And in this background part, basically what I want to explain is this problem of recovering structure in high dimensional signals. And I would like to talk about 2 types of structures which have been studied over the last few years, which is that of sparsity and low rankness. Okay, so I would like, so in this part, I would basically go over some literature on recovering sparse vectors and recovering low rank matrices. So the sparse vectors recovery problem is very much related to the problem that I just described, and it has origins in this literature on compressed sensing. Okay, and so what is this problem? This problem is basically that there is a vector x in Rd and it is k sparse, which means that out of the d entries, only at most k of the entries are non-zero. Okay, so the size of the support of this vector is at most k. And similar to the previous model, what you're given is a linear sketch of this vector. Okay, so this vector x gets multiplied by this matrix phi, and what you get to see is this vector y, which is of much smaller dimension. Right, and the goal here is to basically recover x given the knowledge of y and phi. Now this is basically, we know how to solve this problem. If it's a fully determined system, we just have to invert it. The problem here is that it's underdetermined and there are infinitely many solutions. So which one do you pick? So because there is this underlying assumption of sparsity on x, you would like to pick the sparsest vector out of all these possible solutions. And the work in this literature, it tells you that this here is one way to solve it. You can obtain this vector x as the solution to this optimization problem. So this is the L1 minimization problem. And what it tries to do is to find a vector x that will satisfy the measurements that you're given and such that it has the least L1 norm. Okay. And the motivation behind choosing this L1 norm is that it is some sort of a relaxation of that sparsity constraint. So it will give you a vector that is as sparse as possible. Okay. And this problem is a very simple problem. The original least sparse solution, it's a computationally intensive problem if you try to do it the brute force way. And this program, on the other hand, it's a linear program. You can solve it using linear programming, and it gives you the correct solution with high probability. So this result basically holds when your projection matrix it's drawn from a certain family of random matrices. Okay, and so what is the guarantee that comes along with this, with the solution to this program? It's that if you use a Gaussian phi, which is an M cross D phi matrix with IID Gaussian entries, then the projection, as long as the projection dimension is at least k log D over k, you can recover the true X with high probability. Okay, and this works for a large class of random matrices, not just Gaussian matrices, that satisfy a certain isometry property on the set of k sparse vectors. So what those matrices do is that if two k sparse vectors, they're far apart in RD, then after you project them onto Rm, they still remain sufficiently far apart so that you can distinguish between them. And so this L1 minimization is one way to find this sparse vector x that generated the measurement y. There are several other algorithms that have been studied in the literature, which include greedy algorithms like orthogonal matching pursuit and Bayesian algorithms also. Okay, so this is a very a high level idea of this area, but the point that I want to highlight is that it's possible to recover this d-dimensional vector using a projection dimension that just scales linearly in k and logarithmically in d. Okay. So the second kind of structure that or structured signals that I want to mention is that of low rank matrices. Okay, and this is another thread in the literature, but with a very similar setting to what we just saw. So instead of vectors, we now have matrices. So there is a large D cross D matrix M, which you don't get fully observed. So there are a lot of unobserved entries in this matrix. Okay, and you can think of this as coming, so this was originally motivated from problems in recommendation systems, where you can think of this as being a user item matrix. So each row corresponds to a user and each column corresponds to an item. Okay, this doesn't have to be square or anything, right? And what you have is ratings given by some of the users. Not all the items will be rated by all the users. So this is an incomplete matrix. And what you would like to do is to somehow complete the matrix and then use it to give recommendations to users. You can use it to recommend items to users, right? So in general, it's not possible to complete this matrix. The entries can be anything, but the idea here is that these matrices typically have some structure, and that structure is that of low rankness. So the underlying assumption is that although there are several users here, not all of them will have very distinct behavior. So in the sense that users usually fall into groups, and there is a low rank structure to this matrix. Right. So the problem becomes to complete this matrix under the assumption that it is a low rank matrix. And this is one kind of observation model where you subsample the entries, let's say uniformly at random, but there can be other types of observation models also. Right, and so let's say we look at this subsampling type of observation model, then what this says is that there is a D cross D matrix and you observe a subset omega of those entries. So the entries in omega, so those are the indices that you pick uniformly at random, and there is and the rank of the true matrix, it's, let's say, R. And similar to the previous L1 minimization type approach, here also you can set up this type of a optimization problem, which says that find an X that satisfies your observations. So on the set of indices in omega, it has to equal M, and the one that has the least nuclear norm. And this is it's motivated from similar ideas as in the sparse vector recovery case. So here, what you would ideally like to find is a low rank matrix. So the vector of singular values of that matrix, it will be a sparse vector. It will have a lot of zeros because the matrix is low rank. But that is a combinatorial problem. So what you do is you relax it to the L1 norm. So this nuclear norm is basically the L1 norm of the vector of singular values. And what guarantees does the solution of this program come with? Here also you can recover the true X under some conditions on M using just RD log D observations. Okay, so here also you can see that the actual object that you're working with, it's a D cross D matrix, which has D square entries, but the number of observations that you require it scales like the degrees of freedom that you have, which is order RD, right? So RD is the number of degrees of freedom that you would have for a rank R matrix. One final example that I would like to mention, it comes from this literature on data streaming. So this is from the computer science literature, but this also studies problems related to structured signal recovery. So this is similar to the first example that I gave on sparse vectors. So what is the setting here? The setting is that there is an alphabet U of size D, and what you observe is a stream of data elements that are drawn from this alphabet. Okay, so there is an incoming stream, but let's say you look at it in blocks. So you look at the first n elements that you saw in the stream. Okay, and each element comes from this alphabet. And what you would like to do is to maintain some useful statistics about this data stream. So for example, if this stream is a stream of packets that you see in a network, then you would like to count, let's say, the distinct number of IP addresses that you have seen so far, or you would like to determine which is the most frequent destination address or something like that. And so all these statistics can be neatly expressed in terms of the frequency vector. So there is a frequency vector F with D entries. One entry corresponds, so each entry corresponds to an element in the alphabet. And what it does is that it counts how many times you have seen each element of the alphabet in the stream so far. Right, and so formulated in this way, the distinct elements that you would see is just the size of the support of F, right? This is also denoted as the L0 norm. It's just the cardinality of the support of F. So those will be the number of distinct elements you have seen so far. The frequent elements statistics can be written in this way. It's the set of all heavy elements, right? So it's the set of all Fi that constitute at least some epsilon fraction of the total L1 norm. This is one way to define it. So this would tell you what's the which are all the frequent elements in the stream. So one way to do this is to just maintain this frequency vector. So it keeps this count for each of the elements, but it requires order D space. And the question is, can you do it with smaller memory and be okay with getting approximate answers? So this has been studied in this literature on sketching in data streams, and the answer here is to do something similar as we saw in the first example, is to just take this sketch X. Okay, so this phi matrix is something that you design, and so this X here in this case is the frequency vector. So of course you don't get to observe it, but this phi matrix will tell you how to combine the data as you observe it in a stream, and just maintain this sketch Y of which takes just which is of length M. And at any point of time, you can recover the original frequency vector using L1 minimization. So you only need to store.
Question.
Sorry.
Question. Yeah. So this is with respect to the penultimate bullet. Did you mean order of d log n space or order of d space? There must be some dependence with n, right? If you're maintaining count.
So the count basically, so the frequency vector, it's like a table of d entries. Yeah, okay. So you're asking.
I mean, are you saying it doesn't depend on n? The constant doesn't
so
depend on
let's say you
n?
look at it. So let's say you look at it in blocks of n, and let's say n is less than d, something like that. So I'm thinking of d as the huge number here.
Okay, thank you.
Hi Nilesh, what is k here?
So this was for this problem of finding frequent elements. So the frequency vector will be something that has k very large entries and all the other d minus k entries would be small.
Okay.
So this is roughly similar to the sparse vector case, but with k large entries and all the other entries not exactly 0, but some small value. Right. Okay, so those were the 3 problems that I want to mention briefly. And so the idea that I was trying to bring out is that the requirement, so all those problems that we saw till now, they involve just a single sample. So there is a single sparse vector or a single low rank matrix that you're trying to recover. And the requirement on the sketch size or projection dimension, it's well understood in this single sample setting. Okay, so it scales like it only needs to scale as the degrees of freedom. So the dependence on the actual dimension is usually mild. But so what happens in the case of multiple samples, right? And so in this case, you could have sparse vectors. So multiple sparse vectors, all of them have a common support like we saw in the first problem, or they could have changing support across samples. You could have matrices with some kind of a evolving low ranks, and this type of a problem comes up in, let's say, in video background modeling. So there the background is actually modeled as a low rank subspace, and across frames it can keep evolving. In the streaming example, you could think of a distributed setting where you're getting these data streams from multiple machines, and you want to, let's say, find out the frequent item in all of them. And what is different in the multiple sample setting is that it brings in this question of trade-off between the sketch size and the number of samples. So you have both these resources now, and the question is, since you have samples, maybe you can reduce the sketch size required per sample. And what exactly is this trade-off between M and N? So this has been studied, especially in the case of sparse vectors. This is known as the multiple measurement vector setting, and there are several algorithms known for this. But the number of measurements that you require per sample, it still scales similar to what you require in the single sample setting. Okay, so it's not clear from those algorithms what the benefit is of having multiple samples. The question that we would like to answer is whether when you have a large number of samples available, can you operate with fewer measurements per sample? Okay, so
just
and we look at this.
Yes. Quick question. Can you go back to the previous slide and tell us what was the approximation-based result on frequency once again?
Yeah, it's the last point.
Yeah, previous page, last point.
Yeah. Okay, so the result is basically that you can estimate it to within some epsilon error. So the true frequency vector, it is something that has k heavy entries and d minus k very small entries. And you can approximate it by a vector that is, so your algorithm will output a sparse f hat. It will have k entries and all the other entries 0, and that error can be bounded to a small value provided you have a sketch size that scales like this. So I think I haven't included the dependence on epsilon and all that here.
Is there a log 1 over epsilon or something like that which would come into the picture?
Yes. It would be some factor like that.
Okay, thank you.
Approximation, epsilon is the approximation parameter?
Yeah, so no, so I'm not talking about this epsilon here. So what I was saying is that the L1 minimization, it will output an f hat, and you can bound f hat minus f to be less than epsilon.
I'm not sure if it's logarithmic or polynomial, maybe 1 by epsilon. That part I'm not really sure about. At least,
I'm also not sure.
I think there is an
like
Alon Matthias Szegedy result which says, log 1 over epsilon, where what I need to check is whether what is the nature of the error bound that they assume. I think it's the same. So.
Okay, but is that, do they talk about the L1 minimization problem? Is it the
no?
I
think they have a different algorithm altogether, but the problem is the same.
Okay. Okay.
That's the worst case stream problem, but a similar problem. Yeah.
But they may have a probably approximately correct assessment of the of the frequency. In which case, what I don't completely follow is whether the epsilon is on the error or the epsilon is on the probability that you're far away from the correct frequency.
So here it's the worst case setting. So this, so here there is nothing random here. The only randomness comes from the construction from phi actually.
From what? From the phi. Okay.
From the phi, yeah.
Same as their setting.
So there's two parameters. One is the error parameter of f hat minus f, and one is the probability parameter coming from phi. I haven't included the dependence on either of them here.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, the Alon Matthias Szegedy is there is no. They probably look at the x1 through xn, that streaming one, but the only randomness comes in their algorithm. So I guess you are looking at a linear sketch version of the samples.
Yes.
So that phi is under your control, right? Is
yes,
that correct?
Yes.
Or?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's something similar. But anyway, they have some other methodology. So yeah, your algorithm is also random. Theirs is also random. So the algorithm tosses one. It's not that the sample string can be arbitrary.
No. Stream you can think as worst case.
Okay, thank you. Please go.
Yeah. Okay, so so basically what we are trying to understand is this question of trade-off between the number of samples and the number of measurements per sample that you need to take. Okay, so what we can show, so I'll come back to the first problem that we saw, which is that of recovering the support from multiple samples. Okay, so just recall that we have d-dimensional samples, we have n such samples, and they have a support S of size k, and we observe these noisy linear projections for the samples. And so in the single sample setting, it is known that if you have k log d minus k measurements, then you can recover the support with high probability using Gaussian phi. Okay, so if you have these many measurements, then even a single sample is sufficient. And the question is, what happens when you have multiple samples, and whether you can operate with m even smaller than k per sample. And so yes, you can do that. If you have multiple samples, then you can use a sketch size which is even smaller than the support size. Okay, so a sketch size less than k, you can operate in that regime provided you have number of samples that scales like this. Okay, so it scales like k over m squared log k times d minus k. And so if you think of the overall budget that you have as n times m, then for the support recovery problem, this is what the scaling looks like. So if you're in the m larger than k regime, which is the sufficiently large measurement regime, then it only needs to scale like order k. On the other hand, if you're in the small measurement regime, then it needs to scale like k squared over m. Okay, so so in the remaining part of the talk, what I would like to do is to describe the estimator that would work in this low measurement regime, and then show you the lower bound. Okay. So our results will be in this generative model setting where we assume the samples to be random. Okay, and we have so this is the generative model that we have on the data. The samples are drawn from a distribution. Okay, so let's focus. So in this case, samples are drawn from a multivariate Gaussian with mean 0 and covariance matrix k lambda. So the covariance matrix of the samples is a diagonal matrix, and the entries on the diagonal will denote it using this vector lambda. Okay, and support of this vector lambda, it coincides with the support of the samples. Okay. So any vector drawn from this distribution, it will have support equal to S almost surely. Right. And so what is required? So from this generative model is not, it's the Gaussianity part is not important. You only require some tail assumptions, but it's this covariance structure that is required. This captures the sparsity part in the data. So for this setting, what can we show? We can show that if you have P matrices that are drawn independently for each sample and they have IID normal entries, then the minimum number of samples that you required for this support recovery problem, it scales like k squared over m squared times log k times d minus k. Okay, so this is the small measurement regime where m is less than k over 2 and it only needs to be as big as log k squared. Okay, and support size can be as large as d minus 1. So basically, so I'll first describe the upper bound on n star, how we get that. So I'll describe the estimator first and then we'll go to the lower bound. So the estimator basically is a very simple closed form estimator. It just tries to estimate the variance along each coordinate. So remember that all the support information is captured by that variance vector lambda, and so estimating those variances and thresholding would tell you what the support of the samples is. And so how do we estimate the variance? So it's a very simple estimate. What it does is it does some kind of an inversion operation on the measurements using this matrix P transpose, and then performs an averaging across all samples to get the variance estimate along the ith coordinate. So we'll call this variance estimates lambda tilde, and what you do is you sort all the lambda entries of lambda tilde and pick the top k entries. So the indices corresponding to the top k entries of this estimate will tell you what the support is. Right. So this is closed form and its computational complexity only scales linearly in D. So this estimator lambda tilde, it's biased, but since we only do a sorting type of operation on it, it does not affect the estimate. So the bias does not come into picture. In our analysis, we'll use a thresholding based approach, but this bias is not going to affect that either. Okay, so what we do is in our analysis, we analyze a threshold type approach, which is slightly easier to analyze, and its probability of error of the threshold based approach will be an upper bound on the probability of the sorting based estimator. Okay, so whatever error we get in this case, it will be a valid upper bound for the original sorting based estimator also. And this error probability, you just have to analyze the false alarm and misdetection probabilities of whether an index was in the support, but it got classified as being outside it, or the other way around. Okay, and so just a high level idea of how we bound these error probabilities is that it's based on sub-Gaussian and sub-exponential concentration inequalities. So the idea is that this lambda tilde vector, so there's randomness coming from the phi matrix, the samples, and the noise. So the first step is to condition on the phi matrix and then analyze or bound these error probabilities, taking into account the randomness in phi and noise. So if you look at the expression for the estimator, it's a variance estimate, so it involves squaring these the observations, and the observations depend on x. So the samples that we have, they are sub-Gaussian random variables, and the square is sub-exponential. So it just follows from that condition on phi, you need to use sub-exponential concentration inequalities, and then you get the bound for the error probabilities in terms of the phi matrix. So there you'll use properties of the phi matrix, and for good phi matrices for which you can bound that error probability, you can show that it's small. And good phi matrices are those basically which separate out the entries of lambda tilde, which are able to separate out the entries of lambda tilde into S and S complement. And any matrix with a mean zero sub-Gaussian entries with some assumptions on the second and fourth moments can do this. Right. So roughly that's the idea, that phi matrices that come from this class of distributions, for those matrices you can show the error to be small. Right. And that error basically depends on n, and so when you equate it to some small number and then do the computation for n, it shows scaling like k squared over m squared. So that's the upper bound part. The lower bound part, the idea is to use Fanos method. So what we do is, so the parameter space here is the set of covariance matrices, right? That is what we are trying to estimate, or equivalently the variance vector, because this is diagonal. And the idea is to construct a set of these covariance matrices that are close to each other, so that any estimator would require at least some number of samples to be able to distinguish them. And so that is like setting up this Emery hypothesis testing problem and then using Fanos method to lower bound the error probability. So this construction basically of close by phi matrices is what I've shown here. So you start with of close by covariance matrices. You start with this covariance matrix with the k non-zero entries, let's say, placed in the first k locations, and then remove one entry and add another entry somewhere else in the diagonal. Okay, so there is this set of diagonal covariance matrices that differ in just two locations. And the idea is that the output distribution parameterized by these covariance matrices, you would like them to be as close as possible, so that any estimator would need some number of samples to distinguish between them. And so the distance between those distributions and the KL divergence between those distributions can be shown to scale like this. So the important quantity that figures here is the spectrum of the Gram matrix of the phi matrices. Okay. And so AI and BI are basically eigenvalues of these the phi matrices that parameterize these two competing distributions. And as you can see, there is a gap type of quantity that appears and a negative moment type quantity that appears. And both these can be bounded. This gap can be shown to be constant, and the moment quantity can be shown to scale like m over k to the fourth. And both these combined actually give the k square over m square type scaling. And so with that, I would like to conclude. So what I wanted to present was that it's possible to infer joint structure present across samples using very few linear sketches. And the multiple sample setting, it leads to interesting trade-off questions between the sketch size and the sample size. And there are several interesting extensions that are possible. One could look at samples with changing support. So the support can evolve with the samples, but still exhibit some joint structure. So you could have groups of samples sharing a common support. You could have, instead of exactly sparse samples, you could have approximately sparse samples. You could also look at other types of measurement schemes, not just linear, so two of them which have been somewhat studied in the literature are measurements that just take the sign of the sketch vector and using that recover the original sparse vector. Another type of sort of complementary approach is to look at the case where you only have magnitude measurements, so all the sign information is lost, and using that you would like to recover the true X vector. There is also some work on looking at not just vectors and matrices, but other types of objects like graphs. So in the graph, there is this work on sketching on graphs, where one way to look at this is to just think of this as the matrix version of the problem, that you just look at the adjacency matrix and look at its sketches. But there are other types of extensions possible here, because you could have directions and so on the edges. There is also some work on sketching and projection related work on tensors. Right, so with that, I would like to stop. These are some of the references that you can look if you find this interesting. There are several others, but I've only included a small list.
Question? Hi.
I think Prathamesh has a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So your algorithm depends when you sort it on the knowledge of K.
Yes.
I was wondering if the answer would change significantly if you didn't have knowledge of K.
So what we can show now is that you need, and if you have an upper bound on K, that's okay, that works.
Even if the upper bound is not is significantly bigger than the support.
Okay. Yeah, so in that case, it's not clear. See, or some data-driven threshold approach can be tried, which we haven't tried. So threshold using some function of the sketch that you're given, but I haven't tried that.
Okay, thanks.
Lakshmi, this is Krishna. I had a question. So, so you mentioned that So there's a case where the support might be changing across a batch of measurements. It might
Yeah.
be varying. Yeah. So how will this I mean, how will your approach vary in that case? I mean,
So that's something we are looking at now. So I can tell you, for example, for this model, let's say. So what you can assume is that you have these n samples, and there is a small set of allowed supports that the samples can take. Okay. So let's say in the very simple case, let's say there are 2 allowed supports. So every time you draw a sample, it can take one of those 2 supports. Okay, and then you look at the projections of the samples. So there's 2 unknowns here. First of all, you don't know which support was drawn for each sample. And the second unknown is that you don't know the supports themselves. This problem is much harder than this common support problem that I have explained here. And that difficulty mostly comes because you don't know which support was drawn for each sample. And some different techniques are required. A simple thing that you can do is to first estimate the union of the supports. Okay, and that can be done using this common support algorithm that I mentioned. Once you have that, some other techniques are required to estimate each of the supports individually. So for example, one technique that we have used in our work is to use spectral clustering. So there is some combinatorial type problem there, and spectral clustering turns out to be a good way to estimate all those unknown underlying supports. So yeah, it's different from this case. It does not directly follow from this common support approach.
I see. So then how will the n change there? So you had this n being k squared by m squared, right? So
Yeah,
there how will it work? I mean, your support could be very different across the batches, right? So then how will it work?
Yeah. So the scaling is different in that case. So okay, so I can tell you what we have right now. Not clear if it's optimal or not. If there are, let's say, L underlying supports, okay, so the samples can have any of those L underlying supports, then and each of those supports is of size k, then the scaling is like k over m to the 4th. So it's bigger than what we have here, and some polynomial scaling in L also. It's not clear if those things are optimal, but yeah, roughly this multiple support case is, it seems to me that it's harder than this single common support case.
So it looks like in your in this multiple support problem, the support is arbitrary, and each sample could come from any of the support. Is that what you're saying, or is there a dynamics in which the support changes?
No, so I'm not thinking of it like a time type of problem, but there is a small set of allowed supports, and each sample can draw its support from that small set, but it's not like there is a small, slow, time varying change across those supports. That's a different version.
I see. Okay.
It's a different work or a different question?
A different version, I meant, but that has been looked at, yeah.
What are the kinds of results in that setting?
Okay, so I haven't seen any sample complexity type results. So this problem, okay, I have to think of this time varying thing. I mean, I think there are algorithms that are known, but I'm not sure if any concrete trade-off type question has been answered.
Okay, thanks. So I have a general question.
Yeah.
So there is a unifying perspective for all of these things in terms of the atomic norm methodology that I think Venkat Chandrasekharan had come up with in his thesis, PhD thesis. I'm just wondering, why not use that unifying perspective? Are there some limitations to that?
Okay, so that's a great question. So the limitation of that setting is let me just right. So this idea that the number of observations it only needs to scale like the degrees of freedom, that theory captures this idea, but it's tied to this, at least the way I know it, it's tied to this atomic norm minimization algorithm. So in the framework, these structured signals can be represented using elements from an atomic set. And the recovery algorithm, it basically tries to minimize some norm that is defined by that set. They call it the atomic norm. And these are both special cases, the L1 norm and the nuclear norm. So it's tied to that algorithmic framework. So what we saw is that in the multiple sample setting, all algorithms derived from that type of a framework require measurements to scale in the same way as in the single sample setting. So what that framework would tell you is if when you have multiple samples, you'll use that same atomic norm minimization framework. So for example, for the L1 minimization, the corresponding extension in the multiple sample setting is to use something called the L12 norm. And if you use that algorithm, it still requires the M to scale like K log D, even though you have multiple samples. So somehow it's not clear why it's not possible to operate in the small measurement regime using that framework. So this algorithm that we have now, or this simple estimate, it can operate with M less than K, but it's not coming from that general framework. This is more from a Bayesian setting and trying to estimate variances and so on. So I also don't fully understand, but all those algorithms somehow cannot operate in this small measurement regime, is what I understood. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then let's first thank the speaker for the talk. Yeah, thank you, Lakshmi.
Thank you.
So next week, our speaker will be PhD student Nidhi Rati. So we'll send out an announcement about the talk soon. Thank you for participating in this. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Thank you.